This is number 47 in my series Colonies to Colossus, The Rise of a Giant. In this video, we're going to take a look at the Boston Tea Party. The Boston Tea Party may be the most famous event in American history. On December 16, 1773, colonists dressed as Mohawk Indians in Boston dumped hundreds of chests loaded with over 40 tons of tea into Boston Harbor. It was the event that did more than any other to cause a rupture between the colonies and their mother country, Great Britain. It's important to emphasize that the Boston Tea Party was not a spontaneous riot. It wasn't just a bunch of people angrily going down to the docks and dumping the tea into the harbor. Instead, it was a well-coordinated, carefully organized, and planned event planned by the Sons of Liberty. One of the things I want to emphasize in this video is how thoroughly and yet somewhat covertly the Sons of Liberty had taken control of the colony of Massachusetts Bay. The civil authorities, led by Governor Hutchinson, the royally appointed governor, had really no power to stop the Boston Tea Party from happening, short of bringing in British military force, which would have led to more death and rioting, as we saw during the Boston Massacre. It's important to remember, too, that the Sons of Liberty, for obvious reasons, operated somewhat secretly. This means that there's a lot of gaps in the record and things that happened that we're not certain about. But we do get a pretty good picture because many of the people who participated in dumping the tea came forward years later to give their stories and accounts of what happened that night. Before we dive into the story of the Boston Tea Party, I thought it would be a good idea to take a look at a map of Boston just to review where some of the events and locations are that are important to the story. On the screen right now is a map of Boston. The red line indicates the modern shoreline. As I mentioned in previous videos, a lot of time and effort was spent by Boston city officials increasing the size of Boston by filling it in so it'd have more space. So Boston was quite a bit smaller back in those days. On the right side of the screen, just a little ways up from the bottom, you can see Griffin's Wharf. I've circled the name of the square box so you can identify it, and I've put a red explosion mark around the wharf itself. This is where the Boston Tea Party actually occurred. As you can see today, it's inland, but there is a marker there showing where it actually occurred. So the actual wharf where it happened with the water is not there anymore. It's been filled in by land. A little ways north and west of Griffin's Wharf, you can see the Old South Meeting House, or the Old South Church. This was the largest hall in the whole city where people could congregate. The most important meetings leading up to the Boston Tea Party occurred here. In fact, there was a meeting going on here just as the Boston Tea Party occurred. Across the street from the Old South Meeting House is the Province House. You can see a picture of it now on the screen up there. This was the official mansion residence of the royally appointed governor, and at this time was Governor Hutchinson. So continuing onward with our tour of Boston, if you go a little south of the Province House and mostly to the west, you'll see Samuel Adams' house there nearby. And then south of Samuel Adams' house, you see the green dot. That's where the Liberty Tree is. The Liberty Tree was an important public open-air meeting place for the Sons of Liberty, and in the past we've seen that they used this place. They would summon royal officials to show up and then intimidate them into resigning their offices, or in other ways intimidate them. They tried to do this during the Boston Tea Party, or events leading up to the Boston Tea Party, and it didn't really work this time. Now, a little ways north of the Old South Meeting House is the Townhouse. This was the Capitol building where the official government center was for the colony of Massachusetts Bay. The building is still there. A lot of important historical events have occurred there, even in modern times. And I did a separate video on the town of Boston, and I talked quite a bit about that building and the events that happened there in that previous video. Just a little bit west from the townhouse was the printing office of Benjamin Eads and John Gill. This is where the Boston Gazette was published, which was a mouthpiece for the Sons of Liberty. Benjamin Eads was a high son of liberty. Just a little bit north of the Boston Gazette printing office was the home of Dr. Joseph Warren. He was a key Massachusetts leader and a high son of liberty who was involved in almost all the important events leading up to the Revolutionary War. Had he not been killed at the Battle of Bunker's Hill, I think he would have been an important national and prominent national political figure who probably could have been a contender for the presidency of the United States once the Constitution had been adopted. If you go back to the townhouse and just look a little bit north and east of there, you can see a structure called Faneuil Hall. Back then, it was much smaller than it is today. There was additions made to it. But frequently, it was the place where meetings started, and if they got too many people showing up, it wasn't big enough to hold them all. They would instead move down to the Old South Meeting House, which is frequently what happened. And lastly, slightly north and west of Faneuil Hall was the Green Dragon Tavern. I mentioned this before. This is kind of the official headquarters of the Sons of Liberty. They had a cellar there where they would meet and plan the events. We'll talk more about that. Really important place, kind of the unofficial headquarters of the American Revolution. So the story of the Boston Tea Party begins with a British company called the East India Company. This was like an early corporation. The East India Company was chartered in 1600 by Queen Elizabeth I, and the charter gave the East India Company a monopoly on all English trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. This means east of the southern tip of Africa. More than that, the East India Company was given certain political powers or sovereign powers that they could exercise. They could set up governments, set up governors, raise militia, raise troops, enforce laws, and so forth wherever they went. And of course, this didn't always bode well for the inhabitants of places where they came and colonized. Sometimes they could be quite oppressive and corrupt. The East India Company became a big player in England's economic and political arenas. In fact, the East India Company gave money to Parliament to the tune of £400,000 a year, which was about 40% of the Treasury's total revenues. And the East India Company paid about 1/3 of the customs revenues for England. So the East India Company is a big player, and when they spoke or even burped, people listened, especially politicians. This was compounded by the fact that many members of Parliament owned stock in the East India Company, which in my book is a total conflict of interest. And this would mean that the interests of the government and the interests of the stockholders in Parliament would be intertwined. Despite its power, though, the East India Company was not without its critics, powerful critics. Its oppressive measures in India and in other places in Asia gained a certain amount of notoriety and disgust in London. And Parliament even set up a committee chaired by John Burgoyne, who we'll see later figures in prominently in the American Revolution. He was a British general who surrendered during the American Revolution. He was appointed chairman of this committee to investigate the East India Company's corruption and oppressions. One prominent British politician, Horace Walpole, made this comment. He said, "The oppressions of India and even of the English settled there under the rapine and cruelties of the servants of the company had now reached England and created general clamor here." Attacks on the company multiplied both in England as well as in the colonial newspapers, and even the famous economist Adam Smith joined in the chorus of critics towards the East India Company. He called it a strange absurdity, and he was talking about the fact that it was a company that he was given a monopoly, but also had sovereign powers. He described its fraud and abuse, and that they were inseparable from the management of the affairs of so great a company. At about the same time these things were happening in England, the situation in Boston was interesting as well. After the Boston Massacre, there was a lull in violence, and I think people's interest in the activities of radicals and the Sons of Liberty were probably not as much important to them as it had been before. The Sons of Liberty were always at their most powerful when there was popular irritation towards British policy. Then the Sons of Liberty became the tip of the spear, so to speak, for popular resentment. So I think they were a little bit out of favor at this point. There was really nothing to be resentful about, and people don't like violence or mob activity. Those are never pleasant things unless you're angry. John Hancock himself was not a person who enjoyed mob violence. He didn't like the violence that the Sons of Liberty often engaged in to win their point. And this is where some things take an interesting turn. Governor Hutchinson was ordered by the king himself to try and court John Hancock into becoming a loyalist or at least a supporter. Maybe at the worst, just having neutralized him would be good. All the money and prestige he brought to the Sons of Liberty didn't help the cause of the royal officials. So Hutchinson began a campaign of wooing Hancock away from the Sons of Liberty. He offered him a seat on the council, which John Hancock wisely declined. Another thing that Hutchinson did was to offer Hancock the command of the Corps of Cadets. The cadets were kind of an honor guard who escorted the governor around. They were mounted troops. They had very fancy uniforms. And Hancock was very much flattered that he was given command and made a colonel. I think Hancock very much enjoyed pageantry and being involved in pageantry. In fact, after he got command of this Corps of Cadets, he ordered new uniforms, which included scarlet coats with buff lapels, white gaiters with black buttons, and three-cornered beaver hats with brims turned up smartly, one of them bearing a rosette secured by a gilded button. And very ironically, he actually went to Colonel Dalrymple, who was the commander during the Boston Massacre, asking him to assign a sergeant to drill the cadets. How ironic is that? Now, Samuel Adams and the other high Sons of Liberty were watching all of this, and I think they were a little aghast at it and keeping an eye on Hancock carefully. They had been helping him politically and helping him to get elected to offices, and Hancock was very popular because of the many acts of charity he had done to help people in Boston. So maybe he felt like he didn't need Samuel Adams or the other radicals or the Sons of Liberty to help him at this point. But I think Hancock kind of knew that he was walking a tightrope in one way or another. If he got too chummy with the governor and the loyalists, he himself could be the target of the Sons of Liberty. But if he got too much in bed with the Sons of Liberty and Samuel Adams, he would appear to become one of these radical mob leaders and would make him look kind of lowbrow to the other wealthy Tories and British officials in the colony. So back in London, there were investigations in the East India Company and its dealings and corruption, And not only were they in trouble politically, but they were also in hot water financially. The East India Company owned more than 17.5 million pounds of tea that were just sitting in warehouses that they couldn't sell, and they were close to bankruptcy. The king's new prime minister, Lord Frederick North, who happened to look a lot like the king, had to come up with a plan quickly. The problem was that the English colonists in North America, even though they drank 1 million pounds of tea a year, most of it, about 3/4, was illegal tea that had been brought in by smugglers. So Lord North came up with a plan that would make it cheaper to drink legal tea from the East India Company, and this way the colonists would get a lower price on their tea. They couldn't object to that, and they would also be able to get rid of all those millions of pounds of tea sitting in warehouses in London. So Lord North's plan involved a package of important benefits that the East India Company would get in order to sell their tea cheaply in North America. For example, they could sell tea directly to American colonists without first having to pay duties on it in England. Taxes paid on sales in colonies were reimbursed. And the East India Company was allowed to choose its own agents or consignees, which cut out colonial merchants and other middlemen, which meant that they could then sell it more cheaply. Now, the 3 pence per pound tax on tea that had remained was a holdover from the Townshend duties, which we talked about in an earlier video. And Lord North and Parliament wanted to retain that tax as a principle that showed that Parliament had the right to tax the colonies. It's kind of a symbolic gesture. It was a huge irritant to the colonists, though. Lord North's plan also said that revenue raised by the sale of the tea in the colonies would go to pay colonial royal governors. This also hugely irritated the colonists because they liked the fact that the colonial assemblies, who represented them, could vote the governor's salary or not, and that gave them a certain amount of control over the executive branches in their colonies. So the Tea Act passed Parliament without much debate on May 10th, 1773, and Lord North didn't expect there would be any trouble about it. After all, everyone was getting a benefit. The colonists got a cheap tea, and they got rid of all this tea sitting around that the East India Company needed to sell so they wouldn't be in bankruptcy. And since so many members of Parliament had their hands in the tea company's business, owning stock in it, they certainly wanted their money out, so they were going to get taken care of as well. After becoming acquainted with the plan, Benjamin Franklin made the interesting comment that the English have no idea that any people can act from any other principle but that of interest, meaning that apparently Lord North and his advisors thought that the Americans, their only concern was the cheapness of the tea. Lord North's plan really was like throwing a hand grenade into a gas tank, but it was a hand grenade with a little bit of a slow fuse. It didn't cause a stir immediately after it was passed, but it was the grenade that gave rise to the Boston Tea Party. Lord North was the Prime Minister of Great Britain during the War of Independence, so here he is, newly in office. He starts the war. I don't think he intended to. Then he probably didn't predict it would happen, but he had to stick around to try and clean it up, which he was not successfully able to do. And he kind of has the embarrassment of being the prime minister who saw the colonies become independent during his tenure in office. The Tea Act naturally outraged colonists who felt that Parliament had not taken into consideration their own sentiments and interests on this matter. One writer, writing under the pseudonym A Consistent Patriot, wrote in the Massachusetts Spy newspaper the following. He described the Tea Act as a scheme not only destructive to trade, but designed to promote and increase a revenue extorted from us against our consent. Another writer in the newspaper called the Tea Act a case of taxation without consent and monopoly of trade establishing itself together. And these sentiments reflected the fact that none of the colonial assemblies had a say in this. This meant that all of the American colonists had been disenfranchised. They had no say in a tax put upon them. And because the East India Company had so many products, not just tea, it was felt that other products could be forced on the colonies and would muscle out local colonial merchants, just as this tea was doing, and therefore lead to monopolies all owned and controlled by the East India Company, which was controlled by political interests in London. Another newspaper editorialist, writing under the pseudonym Sidney, wrote, "Shall the island Britain enslave this great continent of America, which is more than 99 times bigger and is capable of supporting hundreds of millions of people? Be astonished, all mankind, at her superlative folly." I'm assuming the writer chose the name Sidney as a pseudonym after Algernon Sidney, who was a famous English political theorist and Whig Republican who was executed back in the 1680s. He was seen as a martyr for the cause of freedom and limited government. Another writer in the Newport Mercury newspaper, which was in Newport, Rhode Island, talked about the threat that any tea ship should be sent, quote, to Gaspee. And if you listen to my last video about the burning of the Gaspee, you'll understand the relevance of that comment. Some editorialists and newspapers even attacked the bad health that tea would cause people who drank it. One writer in the Pennsylvania Journal said, The general state of health has undergone a great revolution by it, meaning the tea, so that our race has dwindled and become puny, weak, and disordered. Probably the hope was that they could discourage people from drinking it naturally, and this way no one would want to buy it anyway. I think it'd be a really good idea to go through some of the events in the weeks just before the Boston Tea Party occurred, starting about the first week of November. Of a special interest are these Boston town meetings that are called. These town meetings sometimes had as many as 5,000 people attending them, almost a third of the population of Boston. Now, these town meetings were not the formal town meetings that you would have when the city selectmen were there to pass laws. These are just meetings called by various local leaders, the Sons of Liberty in particular. But by having an open forum like this for anyone to attend, even the poor or those who couldn't normally vote, it gave broad legitimacy to these actions that the Sons of Liberty are having these town meetings vote upon, because anyone can attend and speak their mind and vote on the issues. It's not a formal legal body formed for the purpose of changing laws or ordinances. Also, with such huge numbers of people there, it gave broad legitimacy to what they were doing, and I'm certain that Thomas Hutchinson, the governor, even though he was not popularly elected, he was chosen by the king, it had to make him nervous that all these Bostonians are showing up to these meetings. After all, what could happen to him? He had no troops to defend him there. One other point that's really important to emphasize as we go through these is to remember that the Sons of Liberty are behind just about all of this. They're the puppeteers, the people behind the scenes, setting up all these various meetings, no matter who's doing it, whether it's the Boston Committee of Correspondence or a town meeting or whatever. They're the ones behind the scenes pulling the strings and making sure people know what to do. Now on the screen you can see a little list of all the things that occurred during most of November. For example, November 3rd, a Wednesday, they had their first Liberty Tree meeting. This was a popular activity with the Sons of Liberty. They had done this during the Stamp Act crisis. They invited all of the tea consignees or the tea agents that the East India Company had picked to show up and to resign their offices. Now none of them did, but nevertheless there were about 500 people there, which is a sizable chunk of people. On November 5th, there was a town hall meeting that adopted the Philadelphia resolves, which had been passed on October 16th. These resolves passed in Philadelphia said that the Tea Act itself was designed to circumvent the legislatures here in the colonies, that it had been done without the consent of the colonists, and basically that it was not going to be, they were not going to allow the tea to land, and that anyone helping or supporting landing of the tea would be considered an enemy of the country. On Thursday, November 18th, there was a second Liberty Tree meeting at which the tea agents or tea consignees were invited to come and to resign their offices. They all declined to show up, of course, and nothing happened more from it. On Monday, November 22nd, the Boston Committee of Correspondence, and we'll talk a lot more about the committees of correspondence, they called for a meeting and invited neighboring towns, which agreed to give resistance to the landing of the tea and to encourage other towns to do so as well. On November 28th, that would be a Sunday, a tea ship, the first of the tea ships, the Dartmouth, arrived in Boston carrying tea. And this is a very important event because the law was once the tea arrived, you had 20 days to declare your cargo and to pay the duties on it. Otherwise, the officials would come out and confiscate the cargo of the ship and sell it at auction. And they didn't want that tea landed, so it kind of put a time clock on everything that they had to pay attention to. Now, one of the owners of the Dartmouth was a guy named Francis Roach, and the arrival of his tea ship put him in a big dilemma. On the one hand, he was terrified of what the Sons of Liberty might do to him if the tea was offloaded and sold. On the other hand, he couldn't just do nothing because the government required the payment of the tax on it, and it put him in a real bad situation. He didn't want to run afoul of either side. He was between a rock and a hard spot. Also on Sunday, November 28th, with the arrival of the Dartmouth, the Boston town selectmen called the consignees or the tea agents to them and they said, hey, what are you going to do to prevent violence now that the tea ships had arrived? So the situation was very, very tense. On Monday, November 29th, another town meeting was called, and the town meeting demanded that the tea be returned to London. The consignees or tea agents were told they should not pay the duty or tax on the tea, and Francis Roach was also again called up and pressured to take the tea back to London. The meeting adjourned at 3 p.m. to give the consignees time to respond to their demands till tomorrow, and a guard of 25 persons was set to make sure that the tea was not landed. One of the things that really irritated the colonists was the fact that all the tea agents were somehow or another either directly related to the governor or were part of his family circle or close friends of his, and that was a huge irritant to them as well because Hutchinson was very unpopular as a governor. On Tuesday, November 30th, another town meeting was convened, and this time Governor Hutchinson, who had caught wind of it, sent the Sheriff Greenleaf, to try and break up the meeting. When the sheriff arrived and tried to break up the meeting, he got booed and shouted down. I think he feared for his own safety, and he left the scene without having done any good. This whole thing, sending the sheriff, infuriated Samuel Adams, who mocked Governor Hutchinson, saying, "His Majesty's representative, he is that shadow of a man scarce able to support his withered carcass or his hoary head. He is a representation of majesty." And Adams went on to defend their right to assemble, saying, "A free and sensible people, when they felt themselves injured, had a right to meet to consult for their own safety." And through those lines, you can feel Samuel Adams' bitterness and anger towards Governor Hutchinson. There was certainly no love lost there. So now with the sheriff sent packing, they got down to business. They summoned the owners of the other ships, the other tea ships that they knew were coming, to appear at the meeting, and they agreed not to let the tea be unloaded. Obviously, they were doing this under duress. And 6 horsemen were appointed to rouse the countryside if the tea was attempted to be unloaded. And obviously this was an attempt to raise the militia who could then march on Boston and destroy the tea or prevent it from being unloaded by British officials. They also set up a church bell alarm system. It was organized so that everyone would know if something happened with the tea, if it was being unloaded or being snuck away or something. On Thursday, December 2nd, a second tea ship, the Eleanor, arrived, and that, of course, kind of upped the ante now as more tea starts arriving in Boston. They've got to do something with it because the clock is ticking. On Thursday, December 9th, the Boston Committee of Correspondence, which were all Sons of Liberty, again met, and they summoned Francis Roach, the owner of the Dartmouth tea ship, told him that he wanted him to return the cargo of tea back to England without loading it. Now, Roach, of course, couldn't do that. There was no way he'd be able to do that legally. So he told them that whatever he had agreed to previously was done under duress, but he still kind of kept straddling the fence. He didn't want the Sons of Liberty to come and tar and feather him or kill him or something. On the other hand, he didn't want to get in trouble with the British authorities. So he just kind of straddled the fence for a while, I think. On Monday, December 13th, the Boston Committee of Correspondence met with neighboring town representatives, and they again summoned Francis Roach, one of the owners of the Dartmouth, which was one of the tea ships, and again continued to pressure him to return the tea to England. Also on that same day, December 13th, the neighboring town of Lexington held a tea-burning ceremony to show their support for what Boston was doing and how they don't want to have the tea unloaded off the ships and their opposition to the Tea Act in general. Lexington is an important town because it's the place where the first shots of the American Revolution will be fired just a year and a half almost later. On Tuesday, December 14th, another town meeting convened, and again they pressured Francis Roach to return the tea to London. This time Roach agrees to go talk to the customs official to see if he can get a clearance so that the ship could legally leave Boston. And a committee of 10 people were assigned to go with him to make sure he followed through with his promise. So Roach does go to the customs officials who flatly tell him they don't have authority to grant the clearance. And so that whole avenue of possibly getting the tea out of Boston is thwarted as well. On December 15th, a third tea ship, the Beaver, arrives. Now there's 3 ships in Boston carrying the tea that they all hate and need to do something about. Now there was a 4th tea ship, the William, but it crashed during a storm off Cape Cod, and so it never entered Boston. So the situation is now very tense. It had been days since the first tea ship arrived. That meant that pretty soon its cargo could be confiscated if the taxes weren't paid on it. And the Sons of Liberty were absolutely determined that the tea ship would not be unloaded, that its cargo of tea would not be unloaded, or that the duties on it would not be paid. Because first, they had no consent in voting those taxes on it, and secondly, the money that was derived from it would go to pay royal officials, thus circumventing the colonial legislature, something they felt was unconstitutional. So that brings us now to December 16th, which is the actual day of the Boston Tea Party. It's all about to come to a dramatic climax as events start to unfold. Before the actual Tea Party itself, there were 2 big events that happened in Boston. The one was secret, and the other was very loud in public. The secret event that I'm talking about was a meeting of the Sons of Liberty at the Green Dragon Tavern, where apparently the destruction of the tea was being planned. And I want to talk about that incident first. And the other, louder event was the big meeting that had almost 5,000 people at it at the Old South Meeting House. And I'll talk about that after I get done talking about the Sons of Liberty meeting in the morning. On the screen right now is a watercolor painting of the Green Dragon Tavern. It's a little bit faded. It was painted by a guy named John Johnston. Up in the top left corner, you can see Masonic symbols. There's a compass and a square. This is also where the Masonic Lodge met. Many of the Sons of Liberty were part of the Masonic Lodge. What's really interesting about this watercolor painting is down at the bottom, there's kind of an inscription near the bottom which says, "Where we met to plan the consignment of a few shiploads of tea." The reason it was called the Green Dragon Tavern is because over the front door, there was a little copper dragon that hung over the door. You can kind of see it a little bit in the picture if you look carefully enough. And because copper oxidizes over time, this little copper dragon soon turned green, and so they just called it the Green Dragon Tavern. On the screen now is a photograph of a paper model of the Green Dragon Tavern that I have on the shelf in my den. Sadly, the original Green Dragon Tavern is not there anymore. There's a new building there that also calls itself the Green Dragon Tavern, but it's not the original. If the original building still existed, it would probably be the highest priority on my bucket list of any place to go see. I don't know exactly what the Sons of Liberty did that morning when they met at the Green Dragon Tavern. No one really does. But in my opinion, that's probably where they sat down and organized what they would do that night to get rid of the tea. It's where they organized the Mohawks, meaning the guys that were going to dress as Mohawks, to get the word out and what they would do and how they would handle that. And I have to emphasize again, the Tea Party was not a spontaneous madcap riot. It was a well-planned, orchestrated incident to get rid of the tea before it became subject to British seizure, and then the money from it would go to fund the British governor and other royal officials in Massachusetts. So everyone knows that the people who actually dumped the tea into the harbor that night were colonists disguised as Mohawk Indians. The Sons of Liberty, using the network of influence that they had, spread the word, encouraging reliable young men to gather at various places around Boston, such as at the Liberty Tree or at different homes. And here they were to put on the disguises. They would paint their face with ashes or burnt cork or grease or other substances, and then they would change into other clothes to make themselves look like Indians. Some of them wrapped themselves in cloaks or put feathers in their hair. They were also told to gather up whatever tools they had, things like clubs, sticks, and hatchets that they could use to destroy the chests of tea. One of the gathering places was at Benjamin Eads and John Gill's print shop. This is where the Boston Gazette was published. I showed that on the map earlier at the start of this video. Eads and Gill were both high Sons of Liberty. In fact, Benjamin Eads had been one of the Loyal Nine, and this is one of the places where the Mohawk young men were assigned to gather. Benjamin Eads had his son keep this punch bowl filled with a drink for the men as they got ready for their night's activity. Now, one of the young men that night that was involved and was dressed like a Mohawk and was involved in destroying the tea was a man named Joshua Wyeth. He was only 15 years old at the time, but he left a pretty detailed account of some of the things that happened, which I'd like to read part of now. Wyeth went on to report that a paper was handed around in a very confidential manner, and that it ordered the men to be ready to destroy the tea. He went on to say that he came to the knowledge of it from his master, who ever lived particular confidence in him. Wyeth was an apprentice, so that's what he meant by his master. He said that most of the persons selected for the occasion were apprentices and journeymen, not a few of them living with Tory or meaning pro-government masters. He also went on to say, "We agreed to wear ragged clothes and disfigure ourselves, dressing to resemble Indians as much as possible, smearing our faces with grease and lamp black or soot, and should not have known each other except by our voices. Our most intimate friends among the spectators had not the least knowledge of us. We surely resembled devils from the bottomless pit rather than men." So the question arises, why did they choose to disguise themselves as Mohawk Indians? Now, it's obvious for such an event as that you'd want to disguise yourself to protect yourself against legal action, but why pick that particular disguise? It may have been out of practical considerations. They certainly would have had the things they would need on hand to disguise themselves that way. That may be the main consideration, but there might be some other things too. On the screen right now is a cartoon that appeared in one of the magazines back then. And the reason I put it up there is because in this scene, you have British officials forcing tea down an Indian woman's throat. And very frequently in these kinds of cartoons and representations, North America, or America in general, is depicted as an Indian woman, which is kind of interesting if you think about it. Of all the things they could use to represent North America, why pick an Indian woman? I don't know if there's any particular connection between this and the choice of dressing like Mohawk Indians for the Tea Party, but I find it an interesting kind of connection. All right, now I want to return back to the meeting that was going on at the Old South Meeting House in Boston. About 5,000 Bostonians, which was about a third of Boston's population, had crammed into the Old South Meeting House. And they had instructed Francis Roach, he was one of the owners of the Dartmouth, one of the tea ships, to go to Governor Hutchinson to see if he can get a clearance to get his ship out of Boston. The people there are adamant that the tea should not be landed and that it should not be seized. They just didn't want it coming to shore in any way at all. So Roach makes the 10-mile trip to Hutchinson. Hutchinson is at his country estate down in Milton, which is about 10 miles south of Boston. I can only imagine what a miserable ride this would have been down there. It was cold and wet and icy. The roads obviously would have been muddy. And the meeting decides to adjourn until 3 p.m. They want to await Roach's answer and what happens between he and Hutchinson. So Roach and Hutchinson meet. Hutchinson refuses to grant him a clearance, but he does offer the protection of the Royal Navy, which Roach wisely refused. Had Roach accepted Hutchinson's offer of protection of the Royal Navy, he would have been doomed. There was no way he could have set foot back in Boston. So Roach begins the return trip back up to Boston. He arrives at about 5:45, and the town, after hearing his explanation of what had happened, excuses him and recognizes him that he had done all that he could do, and he was held blameless, which I'm sure was a relief off his shoulders. Of course, he now had to worry about customs officials seizing his ship. So this all happened between 5:45 and 6 o'clock approximately. Now all the young men that were dressed as Mohawk Indians between 5:30 and 6 had made their way over to the meeting house. Most of them were outside by the front. And after Roach's report, they started making war whoops and blowing whistles. And people that were there reported hearing shouts of things like, "Salt water and tea will mix tonight," and "Boston Harbor a tea party tonight." So there's about 100 to 150 or so of these Mohawks. They make the 10-minute walk from the Old South Meeting House down to Griffin's Wharf. Behind them are a number of people, 1,000 to 2,000 people from the meeting following them. And what's interesting is that the leaders, like Sam Adams and Joseph Warren, John Hancock, they don't go with the people down to the wharf. They stay behind in the old meeting house. This is probably a way to protect themselves against charges they were involved in destroying the tea. One of the unknowns, I wish we knew what was happening with Paul Revere, is we don't know what part he really played in the Boston Tea Party, if any. He may have been there, he may not have been, we just don't know. I'd be curious to know that myself. I want to set the scene for what happens next. It was very cold and damp and icy. The moon was just a sliver, so there wasn't a lot of light. The tide was very low, maybe as much as 14 feet lower than normal, so the ships would have been riding low in the harbor. And Robert Sessions, who was there that night, made this interesting observation. He said everything was as light as day. By the means of lamps and torches, a pin might be seen lying on the wharf. So the guys dressed as Mohawks were very well organized. They divided themselves into 3 companies. Each company then went onto one of the 3 tea ships and got to work. One of the men who was there that night and dressed like a Mohawk involved in destroying the tea was a guy named George Hughes. Hughes left this account. He said, "I fell in with many who were dressed, equipped, and painted as I was. When we arrived at the wharf, there were 3 of our number who assumed authority to direct our operations, to which we readily submitted. They divided us into 3 parties for the purpose of boarding the 3 ships which contained the tea at the same time. The commander of the division to which I belonged, as soon as we were on board the ship, appointed me boatswain, and ordered me to go to the captain and demand of him the keys to the hatches and a dozen candles. I made the demand accordingly, and the captain promptly replied and delivered the articles, but requested me at the same time to do no damage to the ship or rigging. Now the chests that were holding the tea were below deck in the cargo holds of the ships. Each chest was lined with lead, and when full weighed about 400 pounds. So getting these things out of the cargo hold would have been a lot of work. There were about 340 chests altogether, including some smaller ones that contained more expensive teas. On the screen right now, you can see a photograph of one of the chests that was saved and has been handed down since then. So continuing George Hughes' account, he says, "We then were ordered by our commander to open the hatches and take out all the chests of tea and throw them overboard, and we immediately proceeded to execute his orders, first cutting and splitting the chests with our tomahawks so as thoroughly to expose them to the effects of the water." Now, because the chests of tea were so heavy, they had to be lifted out of the ship's hold using hoists and block and tackle. Now, while this was going on, one of the hoists broke, and a chest hit a man named John Crane, one of the Mohawks. Now, they thought he was dead, So they hid his body in a local carpenter shop under some wood shavings, and hours later, after the work was done, they went back to retrieve the body and discovered that he was still breathing. And he must have recovered fully because he went on to live a very full life, including being an artillery officer in the Continental Army during the War of Independence. Now, once the chests of tea were up on the deck, the men then used their hatchets and other tools to break open the tops of them and then to dump the tea out as much as they could with shovels, shoveling it overboard until the chest was light enough that they could throw the rest of it into the water. As I mentioned, that night there was a very low tide. Many of the ships were riding very low in the harbor, and in fact the tea started piling up on the bottom of the harbor out of the water and back onto the ships. They had to use poles to break up the tea clumps and put it back into the water. And some of the men were actually assigned to wade out into the shallow water, that would have been cold, to break up the clumps of tea and the debris from the chests. They took great care not to damage any of the other cargo on the 3 ships, and they did not allow anyone to steal any of the tea. And in fact, one man that was caught putting tea in his pockets was roughed up. They wanted this to be an orderly affair, not just a wanton destruction of private property. Remember, they're trying to send a message to the British government. Returning to George Hughes's account, he wrote, "In about 3 hours from the time we went on board, we had thus broken and thrown overboard every tea chest to be found in the ship, while those in the other ships were disposing of the tea in the same way at the same time. We were surrounded by British armed ships, but no attempt was made to resist us. We then quietly retired to our several places of residence without having any conversation with each other or taking any measures to discover who were our associates." Now, the cost of the damaged tea was enormous. 92,600 pounds, which is over 46 tons, was dumped into the harbor that night. The cost of the tea would have been about 9,659 pounds sterling. And compare this to the cost of Paul Revere's house, which was probably around 213 pounds. So you could have bought several decent houses for the amount of money that this tea was worth. Now, interestingly, one of the people who witnessed the Boston Tea Party, and probably witnessed it in agonizing frustration, was Admiral Montague. Admiral Montague figured large in my last video about the destruction or burning of the ship Gaspee. So he already had a low opinion of the colonists. But without any word from the governor to allow him to intervene, all he could do was sit and watch the destruction of the tea. He made this comment, "The devil is in this people, for they pay no more respect to an act of British Parliament which can make England tremble than do an old newspaper." Now on the screen right now is a map of Boston showing the debris field that happened the next day. All the tea chests and the tea itself floating on the water. It floated a considerable distance. In fact, it went all the way from South Boston out to Castle William. And Castle William was the stronghold where British governors and sometimes other royal officials fled whenever they were put in danger of their life by the Sons of Liberty. In fact, all the tea consignees or the tea agents went there as well to get away from the Sons of Liberty. Now, there was a regiment of troops here that could have been sent into Boston that night, but they would have to have had the governor's permission to do so. And I don't think that Governor Hutchinson wanted a repeat of what had happened at the Boston Massacre. Certainly there would have been bloodshed if the troops had been brought into Boston. And no doubt the local countryside, all the militia, would have been rallied and brought into Boston to try and oppose them. That would have been really bad. So while Paul Revere's role in the Boston Tea Party is still kind of mysterious, we do know that he took news of the Boston Tea Party to both New York and to Philadelphia. This would be the first of many rides for him. So Boston wasn't the only of the 4 large towns to have a tea party. The other 3 towns, New York, Philadelphia, and Charlestown, also had their version of a tea party. Now in New York, Governor Tryon, who was a little more flexible than Hutchinson, he'd made an agreement with the Sons of Liberty that he would not allow the tea into the harbor, and in exchange the Sons of Liberty agreed to provide provisions for the tea ship so they could return to England. So the first tea ship arrived in New York. It was called the Nancy, arrived on April 18th, 1774. It had been blown off course by a storm, so it was late. It was carrying 698 chests of tea, and the captain of the ship received a threatening letter from the Sons of Liberty, and no pilot would guide the ship into the harbor. And the tea agents themselves were terrified for their safety, so they refused to receive the tea. But before the Nancy could return, another tea ship, the London, arrived in New York on April 22nd. And while Governor Tryon mulled over what to do about the situation, a mob of New Yorkers boarded the London and threw her cargo of tea into the harbor because they were unwilling to risk that it might be secretly unloaded or stored somewhere where they couldn't get to it. So news of the Boston Tea Party arrived in Philadelphia on December 24th, Christmas Eve, and the news caused celebrating. Church bells rang in celebration, and the newspaper headline gleefully read, "Christmas box for the customers of the Pennsylvania Journal." The following evening, a cargo ship, the Polly, was spotted coming up the Delaware River towards Philadelphia carrying 697 chests of tea. The captain of the ship received an ominous warning from the Committee of Tarring and Feathering, who let him know that they had 10 gallons of hot tar ready for him. A town meeting of 8,000 people, the largest gathering in North America up until that time probably, met in the courtyard behind the building that we call Independence Hall. And with all this pressure, the tea agents refused to accept the tea. On December 28th, the Polly left Philadelphia to sail back to England, and I'm sure the captain was happy to get out of there too. So lastly, that brings us to Charlestown, South Carolina. Now today we call it Charleston, but it was originally named Charlestown because it was named after King Charles. Now Charlestown had its own version of the Tea Party, but it was a little different and it had a twist. The first tea ship arrived on December 2nd, the cargo ship London, carrying 257 chests of tea. A town meeting was held the following day and pressured the tea agents there not to accept the tea. Meanwhile, the tea remained on board the ship. The acting governor, Lieutenant Governor Bull, had this to say. He was outraged by these actions. He said, quote, "While not equal in criminality to the proceedings in other colonies, but still a most unwarrantable insult to the authority of the kingdom." He was mad that they were actually resisting having this tea landed. But Lieutenant Governor Bull was a little sneakier. He had secret plans for the tea. He arranged in the early morning of December 20th, just before the 20 days expired, to have all the tea chests hauled into the basement of the Exchange building. It's a building that's still there, ironically. And of course, this infuriated the Sons of Liberty and others who thought they had an arrangement with him, but he was sneaky about it. Another tea ship, the Magna Carta, arrived, and it only had 2.5 chests of tea. The captain swore he didn't know that they were aboard his ship, and he promised to leave them aboard the ship while other cargo was unloaded. However, these 2.5 chests of tea ended up in the same cellar with the other ones, and of course this caused furious anger with the Sons of Liberty, who continued to feel like they were being tricked into not doing anything. Finally, a third ship, the Britannia, arrived on November 1st, 1774, carrying 7 chests of tea. So not taking any chances this time that the governor would secretly load it into this basement, the Sons of Liberty went out, they forced their way aboard the ship, and threw the tea into the harbor, just like they had done in Boston, to the cheers of a large crowd on the shore watching the whole event. The Charlestown Gazette made this following quote, "At noon, an oblation was made to Neptune of the said 7 chests of tea." In my next video, we're going to take a look at what the reaction to the Boston Tea Party was, both in England and in the other colonies. For further reading on this topic, I recommend the following books and articles. Defiance of the Patriots, The Boston Tea Party and the Making of America by Benjamin L. Karp. American Tempest, How the Boston Tea Party Sparked a Revolution by Harlow Giles Unger. Cradle of Violence, How Boston's Waterfront Mobs Ignited the American Revolution by Russell Bourne. Cities in Revolt, Urban Life in America, 1743 to 1776 by Carl Breidenbaugh. Desperate Sons, Samuel Adams, Patrick Henry, John Hancock, and the Secret Bands of Radicals Who Led the Colonies to War by Les Standiford. The Urban Crucible, The Northern Seaports and the Origins of the American Revolution by Gary B. Nash. Prelude to Independence, The Newspaper War on Britain, 1764 to 1776 by Arthur M. Schlesinger. Peter Oliver's Origin and Progress of the American Rebellion, A Tory View, edited by Douglas Adair and John A. Schutz. Historic Taverns of Boston, 370 Years of Tavern History in One Definitive Guide by Gavin R. Nathan. Writings of Samuel Adams, Volume 3, 1773 to 1777, edited by Harry Alonzo Cushing. A Revolutionary, Samuel Adams by Stacy Schiff. John Hancock, Merchant King and America Patriot by Harlow Giles Unger. A True Republican, The Life of Paul Revere by Jane E. Triber. Founding Martyr, The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero by Christian D. Spigna. The Company, A Short History of a Revolutionary Idea by John Micklethwaite and Adrian Wooldridge. Colonial Pennsylvania, A History by Joseph Illick. Faces of Revolution, Personalities and Themes in the Struggle for American Independence by Bernard Balin. 7 Myths About the Boston Tea Party by Benjamin Karp, published in the Journal of the American Revolution, November 12, 2013. The Tea That Survived the Boston Tea Party by James R. Fichter, published in the Journal of the American Revolution, June 20, 2019. Tides and Tonnage, A Different Take on the Boston Tea Party by Hugh T. Harrington, published in the Journal of the American Revolution, March 9, 2015. I also recommend the following electronic pages and articles: thefreedomtrail.org, www.bostonteapartyship.com, and the British East India Company, published at www.battlefields.org.